Tonight's story is brought to you by PhoenFX. PhoenFX is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to helping charities with fundraising by providing them with the most innovative scarehouse and walkthrough events. They have created fully adaptive environments for the sensory sensitive so that everyone can enjoy the experience. For more information on PhoenFX and their services, please visit them on the web at www.phonfx.org. Without further ado, tonight's tale awaits you, right through there.
Welcome, my friends. Come, sit around the fire and let me spin another tale for your amusement. These tales, I tell you, these nightmares found only around the fireside, speak of many things, things which cannot be explained. Stories of the unknown, the unseen, and poorly understood. Some disturbing, yes, some terrifying, certainly. Stories of the darkness which reside in all of humanity, expressed in ways in which nature herself cannot account for, things beyond her ability and even beyond her comprehension, stories buried in time and hidden by shadow. Good evening and welcome to another episode of Fireside Nightmares. Tonight's story is one of an old West legend, hereunto untold. Jonah Barnes is a bright young man and perhaps too curious in nature, but his desire to explore certain hidden histories is indeed admirable. Instead of recounting his tale myself, let us bring him and his compatriot, John Oakley, around the fireside to regale you with his adventure on a small ranch just south of Dallas, Texas.
Listen, son, I don't know how you tracked me down or why you'd want to, but if what you're looking for is that damn book, it ain't here. It don't even exist except in fairy tales and ghost stories. Never had, never will.
It was what I was looking for, only, at that time, I didn't know it. I had only found rumors of it while I started my research for the biography of Nash Weaver Slim LaRue I was planning on writing. I probably shouldn't have asked as many questions about it as I did, but it seemed to be an important part of the story John Oakley was telling me. I had been sitting on the porch of an old homestead just east of Dallas. Finding the Oakley homestead hadn't been easy. The Oakley family had remained quiet in terms of their community impact and notoriety for several generations. But as time passed and records once considered private were becoming public at an alarming rate because of the internet, a low-key and off-grid lifestyle was becoming far more difficult. John Oakley was a man in his 60s, strong and weather-beaten. He had spent his life on this homestead, as his father had before him, and his hands and eyes showed it. The two-story house had been freshly painted a few months ago, had been once every few years, and will continue to be painted every few years as long as John Oakley lived. His wife Christy was a little younger, still pretty in her threadbare but expertly mended sundress as she served us iced tea while we talked on the porch. She kept herself inside, though. She had heard these stories before and didn't much care for them. I can't blame her, honestly. The stories Oakley was telling me sounded very much like Old West ghost stories. Except, me? I'm Jonah Barnes. I'm a recent graduate from Swarthmore with a master's degree in history. Some people in my class focused on the history you could already find in the history books. But that's not where you find history. No, the only history worth studying is the history in danger of being forgotten. Every area has its own fading history, a history that is trying, in some cases, deliberately, to be forgotten. It's often ugly, scary, and not one any particular area or person wants to own. But it needs to be chronicled, and that's my calling, to chronicle the strange, absurd, horrifying, and yet true history. It seems a stretch that I would have learned about an 1800s-era band of outlaws in Texas, but there was something about Nash Weaver Slim LaRue that excited the imagination, and that was something I simply couldn't resist. Maybe their history would be bland, typical for outlaws in Texas. They all seem to have similar stories, with the only variances being circumstance or minor details. A man, born poor, kicked around by various people, maybe his parents, or the town's populace, the law, or the natives. finally loses enough that he decides he's going to take it back. He becomes an outlaw, finds people like him, and they start taking it back. But they don't stop when they've regained what they've lost. No, they get greedy, and finally they end up swinging from the gallows in some backwater town by some provincial sheriff or Texas Ranger. But LaRue's story was different, and that's what intrigued me. Yes, he was killed, not by hanging, but in ambush by Texas Rangers in 1842. That should have been the end of the story. It wasn't. I found a daguerreotype of him from the 1850s in an Illinois collection, and one from the 1860s in the Swarthmore College archives in Pennsylvania. After that, nothing. But how does a guy who was killed in Texas get his picture taken 20 years later and put into an archive 1,500 miles away? So, I spent some time researching Slim. He has an interesting family history, old Slim does. His grandfather was a French captain of a merchantman named Jacques-Émile Leroux. He was carrying supplies to America from France and had stopped over in London for a quick bit of business, take on extra cargo, and restock some necessary supplies. A part of the extra cargo he took on at the port of London was a man named Harville and his family, and a household worth of crates. Leroux had the room, and Harville had the money. Leroux was paid extra for the captain's quarters, a direct route to North Carolina. Leroux figured he'd do a little Caribbean back and forth before returning to France, and to ask no questions. He found the terms acceptable, and they were off onto a 6-week run, marked by impossibly good trade winds and fair weather, which allowed them to make the trip in less time than normal. I found this little factoid interesting, but otherwise unremarkable, until I sat down to speak with John Oakley, homesteader. As to what I was told by Mr. Oakley, well, that made this story far more interesting. Leroux made port in Port Beaufort, near Cape Lookout in North Carolina, and saw to the de-embarkment of his guests, the Harvilles of which that Leroux had never seen again. But during his layover in North Carolina, Leroux spent some time in the company of a pleasant French expatriate of moderate means, and before he left for the Caribbean, he left her with child. Though not married, the woman gave the male child his father's last name, but not before moving her and her household to the territory of what would once again be under French control, known as Louisiana. She raised her son, Jean-Baptiste Leroux, there, and when he was old enough, he left her behind, moving himself to Texas. With his moderate earnings, he bought a homestead, found a wife, and made a living as a farmer. That is where Nash Weaver, and soon to be known as Slim, Leroux was born and raised. Both of Leroux's parents died while he was in his 20s, and taking what he had learned from his father and his wife's younger brother, Levitt Whitaker, that homestead became a moderate ranch. They ran cattle and grew crops, and generally made a success of themselves. They hired on ranch hands as necessary, and 2 of them became like family, William Austin Riordan and John Oakley. I assume John is a family name. I'm not willing to believe, quite yet anyway, that the man I was talking to and the man who played such a pivotal role for the man I was writing about were the same man. Blights, droughts, rustling and thievery, tribal warfare, and other tragedies were common in the new Republic of Texas, and the ranch had fared through them all, except for the last one. The cattle had been stolen or slaughtered to feed the family, the crops didn't grow back, and money was growing scarce. Taxes went unpaid, and one day the government of Texas came to collect. Instead, they took possession of the land and house, forcing Nash and his family to leave the home they had worked so hard to create. The strain of losing everything was too much for Nash's wife, and her body succumbed to some unknown disease a week before they were to be evicted. They had just enough time to bury her on the land before the government came to remove them. A week had passed, and the 4 of them, Nash, Levitt, John, and William, were sitting in a saloon in the new settlement of Dallas discussing what to do. The 4 had always made a good team, and had decided to stick together. Finding fortune together would be far easier than finding it alone. All men were angry over the loss of the ranch, but none more than Nash. As it was told to me by the current John Oakley,
My granddaddy's granddaddy told him the stories of Slim Leroux. See, son, after the whole thing went down, the family was forced to change their name and go into hiding. But when he knew he wasn't long for this world, he called my granddaddy's daddy into the room and told him everything. It took 3 days, but the whole sordid affair came out, and he charged my granddaddy's daddy to restore their true name to the family with his firstborn and go back and buy the land that was promised to them. He had the money hidden, but before he would tell him where it was, he made him swear to his terms. As the story goes, Nash made them all a deal. He said that the government had stolen everything from him and he wanted it back. Since they weren't going to give it to him willingly, he was going to take it from them. He promised the boys that if they could take enough back, they would rebuy the property with the government's own money and he would split the ranch 4 ways, as long as they all worked together to make it a success like they had before. When asked how he planned to do it, he told them he was going to find every government money train he could and leave them empty. The men, being drunk, mad, and destitute, agreed. And that there was the start of Slim's gang. They were a mite bit successful too. One heist led to another, and soon money was being stockpiled on all fronts. Once they had enough to buy back the land, they continued to create their own personal fortunes. That turned out to be a mistake, and their last run was at a stagecoach transporting a government payroll. It had an armed man sitting next to the driver and one on the inside guarding the safe and the mailbag. Slim and his gang rode up on it and killed the 2 guards. They took the safe and blew it right there. They took the money inside but left the driver and the mailbag and rode off. My granddaddy told me that his granddaddy always regretted not killing the driver when they had the chance. Not because he hated him, but because when that driver got back to his next stop, he described the entire gang in detail. The safe on that stagecoach contained the pay for the lawmen and rangers out that way. Neither group took kindly to having it stolen from them, and they immediately set out to look for the gang. It took them a week, but they found the gang and managed to corral them in a dry riverbed. Instead of arresting them, the lawmen opened fire on them, killing every member of the gang. Or so they thought anyway.
John Oakley took a sip of iced tea from his glass. Drops of condensation spilled onto his lap, but he didn't seem to mind.
Rio and Whitey, he continued, were dead. My granddaddy's granddaddy was hurt and knocked loopy. Slim, well, he thought old Slim was dead too. He didn't know how long they laid there, but after a spell, a man came walking out of the scrub. He was tall, thin, and old-looking, and dressed in a simple black jacket and trousers with a white shirt and a wide-brimmed black hat. He held an old, leather-bound book in his hand. He looked like a preacher to my granddaddy's granddaddy. Apparently, he looked that way to Slim, too, because Slim tried to warn him away, saying there was no souls that needed saving here. Your soul, Mr. LaRue, is not my primary concern. The stranger's voice was even and unhurried. He spoke with a British accent, and it was one of an educated man. Your grandfather was of service to my family, and I wish to repay the favor. Slim coughed and spat blood onto the ground. I ain't never known my granddaddy. That's a shame, Mr. LaRue. He was a good and reliable man. Except to my grandma. Yes. The voice grew pensive with reminiscence, and then returned to its cultured and yet jovial tone. Nonetheless, my family owes you a debt in his name. I should like to repay it. It's a bit late for that, preacher. No, I am not a preacher. And Mr. LaRue, it doesn't have to be too late. What you getting at, stranger? You have much work yet to be done, isn't that correct, Mr. LaRue? This is no time to crawl into an early grave. Let me help, and then you can finish your work. What game are you playing, mister? I'm about dead, and this ain't funny. As I said, Mr. LaRue, your family did mine a great service, and I am now here to repay that favor. What is it you're planning on doing? Slim coughed and spat more blood. I'm going to give you what you seem to be lacking right now, Mr. LaRue. I'm going to give you what your family gave mine, a second chance. So you're a doctor then? Of sorts, Mr. LaRue. I can heal your wounds and give your life back to you. The stranger had walked closer now. He stood next to Slim. Slim's eyes followed his every step. The stranger's hat cast a shadow over Slim's bloodless face, and he felt a little life return to his sunburned and bullet-riddled body. What's this going to cost me? Just your current suffering, Mr. LaRue. Nothing more. You're the devil, then?" The stranger laughed. "No, I am not the devil, or a devil of any sort. I just possess knowledge which could be of service to you." Sounds like something the devil would say. "Mr. LaRue, it is getting warm out here. The choice laid before you is whether you die here in the desert, or you live to see many, many more sunrises from anywhere in the world you wish. Which sounds better, What's your name, devil?" "Harville. Oberon Harville." "Well, Mr. Harville, I choose life if you have it to give." The stranger smiled. "Sleep now, Mr. LaRue. I'll return after the sun sets." Slim closed his eyes and slept. My granddaddy's granddaddy didn't, however. He told my granddaddy's daddy that he found some scrub to give him shade until nightfall. He watched Slim sleep, and the sleep of death it was too. As the story was told to us, if it wasn't for the movement of Slim's chest, he'd just crawled out of that scrub and given Slim up for dead.
John Oakley adjusted his seat again and leaned towards me.
"Now, son, this is where the story starts getting strange."
He took another sip of his drink before starting again.
"It's the parts me and my daddy don't hardly believe. I always figured it was just a ghost story, but since you're here, you might as well hear all of it. After night fell, the stranger came back, on a horse this time. The saddlebags looked like they was full of stuff, so much that the buckles were on the last hole, and the leather looked a bit strained. With a wave of his hand, one of the saddlebags unbuckled itself and a bag of something dropped into the stranger's hand. He then walked over to Slim and drew 2 large circles around him, one inside the other. The inner circle was large enough for Slim and the stranger and a number of his supplies from the saddlebags. The horse was tied far enough away from the circles as to not be in the way. The stranger then opened his book and began reading out of it in some strange language. My granddaddy always said that his granddaddy told him that he saw it glow red, and then between the 2 circles on the ground glowed red too, and he watched shadows move back and forth in that red light. He always described them as being nightmarish shadows, claws and sharp teeth, and if these shadows could make noise, they'd be snarling like wild beasts about to make a kill. He said those shadows haunted his dreams for years. He said he saw them around corners during the day too, whenever he was with Slim after all this, but that's getting ahead of myself. Anyway, as the shadows circled around Slim and the stranger just kept reading out of that book of his. Slim's body floated up to about the stranger's head. That's when the stranger reached into the red light between the circles and grabbed one of them shadows. The other shadow stopped and watched as the stranger pulled the shadow from the red area and into the inner circle with him and Slim. The air grew real still just then. No birds or other critters dared make a sound. The stranger let go of his book and it just floated there like Slim was doing. He drew something on the shadow with his finger and it glowed red too. What he drew, I mean, not the shadow. And then he took that shadow and put it into Slim's body. As it was told to me, he started after a brief pause. Slim's eyes opened wide when the shadow hit his chest, and he let out a scream that my granddaddy swore you could still hear in that riverbed even to this day. I ain't ever wanted to go there to find out myself, so don't bother asking where it is. Welp, after that, the red lights went out and Slim's body hit the ground like he'd been thrown from a horse. The stranger walked out of the circles he had drawn and over to calm the horse down. He took something long out of the long gun sling and brought it back to Slim. Slim just laid there breathing hard but very awake. "What did you do to me, devil?" he demanded of the stranger. "I repaid my debt to your family. I gave you your life. Now listen. When you wake in the morning, you will see things differently. You will hunger differently. You will be different from everyone else. You are now special, Mr. LaRue. And unlike anyone else you will encounter, you are now free to do as you see fit, with one exception." The stranger held the long object from the gun sling up to Slim. You will finish what you have started, Mr. LaRue, but you will do it differently. Before you take your revenge on the men who killed your friends, before you exact that same revenge on the men who stole your ranch and thereby killing your wife, you will brand them with this. Do you understand, Mr. LaRue? Slim nodded his head obediently. My granddaddy said that was the only time his granddaddy had ever seen Slim follow anyone's orders blindly, other than his wife's when she was still alive. The life you have is fleeting, Mr. LaRue. Marking those whom you take revenge upon is the only way to keep it. Otherwise, a mere walking corpse you shall ever be. Now sleep, Mr. LaRue, and I shall be watching. Slim's eyes closed again, and the stranger walked off into the desert, leaving the horse and saddlebags, the brand, and Slim behind. Morning came, and Slim woke up. He stood and looked at his clothing. It had several blood-stained holes where the lawman's bullets ripped through, but there were no holes in Slim, not even scars. My granddaddy said that's when his granddaddy came out of hiding and called to him. He said Slim turned around quickly, faster than he had ever seen Slim move before, and looked him dead in the eyes. "Oak, that you old codger, you still alive?" Slim's excitement overtook him and ran over to his old friend. Slim looked real skinny, as my granddaddy said, like a corpse. Sunken eyes and cheeks, skin a funny color. Yes, sir, like death himself. "Yeah, Slim, I'm alive, but you shouldn't be. I watched them put all sorts of lead into you." Slim smiled and moved around, showing the holes in his shirt. "I'm alive, Oak, and that's all that needs to be said on that. Can you move? Can you ride? We got lawmen to find." As the story goes, they did just that. The first one they found in a saloon not too far from that riverbed. Slim walked in. The lawman saw him and tried to draw. From across the room, Slim ran at him and had his gun before he could finish clearing the leather. He grabbed the lawman and dragged him out into the street. My granddaddy's granddaddy saw what Slim didn't. That stranger was sitting in the back of the saloon watching the whole thing. He watched the stranger leave the saloon after Slim and the lawman, and then followed them all down the street into a blacksmith shop. Now, I ain't never heard of a blacksmith leaving his fire unattended, but my granddaddy swore that's what his granddaddy had told him had happened. Slim put that brand into the fire while he pushed the lawman against the back wall of the blacksmith shop. He took one of the blacksmith's fire poker and shoved it as hard as he could through the shoulder of the lawman and pinned him to the wall. Slim tore the lawman's shirt open, and when the brand was glowing red, he burned that symbol deep into the lawman's chest. The lawman screamed but did not go unconscious. Instead, my granddaddy said his head hung and he drooled. He said Slim laughed at this and then took the lawman's gun, aimed it at the lawman's head, and pulled the trigger. And that, according to my granddaddy, is where things got downright evil. As the lawman died, Slim's skin got normal and he started looking healthier. But it wasn't just Slim. The stranger, too, now looked younger, healthier, and stronger. Slim and the stranger both laughed, and the only word spoken during that whole horrible event was the stranger talking to Slim. "Good," he said. "Now, find the rest." And that was it. My granddaddy's granddaddy rode with Slim to find the other lawmen, and then to find the men who took the ranch from them. And it was the same each time as I was told, though the stranger was only there for that first time. After that, my granddaddy's granddaddy and Slim parted ways. Slim went up north while my granddaddy's granddaddy got the money they had stashed, moved west for a while, and changed his name. When he came back, he found the old LaRue ranch, bought it, and then marked out 1/4 of it and built his home. He settled down finally, found a wife, raised a family, had grandbabies, and then passed on the truth to them when he was about dead himself. My granddaddy's daddy found the hidden money and stashed it safely on the property. That money kept them through hard times, got the kids going to good schools, and finally the family went their ways. Once my granddaddy passed, all but one of the children had left. My daddy stayed on that ranch and raised his own family. And so here I am. The only Oakley left on the what is now the Oakley Ranch, used to be the LR Ranch. But you knew that, didn't you?
I answered his question with a flurry of others. The questions about the book and the stranger he ignored, but he answered everything else the best he could. When I pressed him on the whereabouts of the stranger and the book, he, at first, gave some non-committal answer and then grew quite testy about it. I thought it would be a pretty good idea not to push any further. Besides, I had a starting point. Jacques-Émile Leroux and Oberon Harville.
A Texas outlaw and a British expatriate with his own dark and devilish history. I am sure we'll be hearing more of Oberon Harville in the coming months. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Fireside Nightmares.
Tonight's episode of Fireside Nightmares was sponsored in part by Everbright Solutions. When you need your lighting display done by professionals and done right, Everbright Solutions is there for you. Find them on Instagram at everbright_solutions_LLC and also by Redicus. Redicus is a leading cross-border e-commerce enterprise with a diverse product lineup including service calling systems, guest pager systems, tour guide systems, window intercom systems, conference devices, FM transmitters, and radios. Find them online at www.retekess.com. Be sure and listen in next time for the newest installment of Fireside Nightmares. These original short stories, based on folklore, urban legends, and the odd, demented flight of fantasy, are sure to entertain and terrify. From all of us at Fireside Nightmares and PhoenFX, good night.